Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So this week we continue with narratives. So I want to add to our list of terms and concepts that we started last week. So you'll remember back in week 2, we went over the basic elements of narrative. So things like theme, setting, characters, plot, the sequence of that plot, point of view, all the basics. This week, I want to add a few additional terms. We'll go through definitions for those terms, and these are just additional tools that will help us to understand the narratives that we read, and eventually they will help us to construct our own narratives. So remember, all the terms that we covered last week are still found in the week 2 module, and if you go to the week 3 module, I would actually like you to kind of follow along with what I'm covering here in lecture. So you have two choices. You can either go to the week 3 overview, where I've provided our new terms and definitions inside the overview, and you can just read along, or you can open the PowerPoint, the same PowerPoint that I shared with you last week. I've updated it. I've added these new terms. There's a link to the PowerPoint inside the week 3 overview, and you can also access it just on our main module page under week 3. So you can open the PowerPoint or just go into the overview, but try to follow along as I cover these key terms. But first, let me just say a quick word about pre-writing. You'll also notice in the overview that I've included some information about some pre-writing strategies that we might want to consider as we start thinking about our own narratives. So I don't want to make anybody panic or feel like our essays are due in the immediate future, because they're not. They're going to be due at the end of week 5, our descriptive narrative. So we have a lot of time to work on those, and we're going to be going through several stages of the writing process. So we have plenty of time. Don't get nervous. I just wanted to plant the seed of pre-writing. I just wanted you guys to start thinking about idea generation. Start thinking about the stories that you might like to tell in the weeks to come. So it's never too early to get started. You can jot down some ideas, and we can think a little bit more about drafting, getting started on rough drafts maybe late next week, and of course early in week 5. So I just wanted to make sure you guys are clear on why I put the pre-writing there. I'm going to put that same information in the week 5 module, and we're going to sort of go through it together. But right now, some of us might be ready to start jotting down some ideas, or to at least start brainstorming and just thinking about what our own narratives might be about. But you have plenty of time, once again, and we're going to continue to read examples of narratives from 50 essays. So as we're going through these new terms today, I would like you guys to start looking for some of these things in the narratives that we read. You can also look for those elements that we covered last week. Some will be easy to find, others might require a little bit of searching, but this will make you a better reader, and eventually it will make you a better writer if you can not only define these terms, but also locate them in actual narratives. Sort of see them at work, see them in action. So hopefully you're following along, you see these terms, and you also see definitions. So I'm just going back through that, but I thought I could provide some examples and a little bit of further explanation here in lecture, just to make sure that we are clear on what everything means and we are prepared to start using this stuff. So let's begin with imagery. This is a pretty easy term, a pretty easy concept. Most of us already know what this is. We've all seen, we've all read enough, I should say, to be able to sort of know imagery when we see it, or when we hear it, or when we come across it on the page. But what I want you guys to think about when you think about imagery are 5 senses. Think about sensory impressions, sensory experiences. So imagery really just refers to any words or phrases, or in some cases maybe even entire sentences, that make readers use their 5 senses. And remember, the five senses are sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch. So, of course, the word of this term kind of says it all, kind of gives it away. We're obviously thinking about our sense of sight first and foremost. We are thinking about images, mental images. So whenever you're reading and you come across words or sentences that make you see whatever it is the author is describing, that means imagery is at work. So there's a kind of an old expression, good writers can paint pictures in the reader's minds. That is imagery. That's what we're describing there. So this is when writers make you see what they are describing or what they are sort of presenting in their stories, in their narratives. So maybe you see a beach, maybe you see a beautiful mountain range, maybe you see the exact classroom or the exact church or the exact street corner where things are occurring. So obviously we can think about images, we can think about ways that specific language in texts make us see things. But don't forget about the other senses. Imagery can also refer to other sensory impressions. So in some cases, words or sentences might make you smell certain things. They might make you hear certain things. They might make you taste or even physically feel certain things. So of course what we're talking about here is the difference between literal meaning and figurative meaning. So obviously if you're reading and the writer is using vivid, specific language to make you see a beach, smell the sunscreen lotion, and hear the children playing in the surf, you're not actually experiencing those things. Obviously, we know that. I just want to be clear. You're operating at this point on a figurative level, not necessarily a literal level. You're not actually at a beach. You're not actually hearing small children. Of course, your imagination is at work, but the imagination is being sparked or fueled by specific language that contains imagery. And that imagery gets your imagination in motion, and it sort of takes you to wherever the narrative is. It takes you to a new place. It puts you wherever the author wants you to be. And it makes you experience what the characters are experiencing. It makes you see what they see, smell or hear what they smell and hear. So this is pretty important, right? If we're going to be transported by a text, by a narrative, that probably means that imagery is playing a large role. So just remember all five of those sensory impressions and try to find ways that the narratives we read tap into all of those sensory impressions. Obviously, again, you're going to find the most examples with sight. You're going to see a lot of images, but that's not all that we should notice. So, all right, that's good for imagery. Let's move on to characterization. This is another one that's pretty easy to define. We kind of already know what this word means. Last week we talked about characters, and we basically made the obvious statement that most narratives are inhabited by people, and those people are characters. We talked about the protagonist being the main character of a narrative, and typically the antagonist will be opposed or against the protagonist in some way. But the antagonist is not always a person, and it's not always a good versus evil, black and white sort of simple conflict. Oftentimes it's more complex than that. So we know about characters. But what we need to think more about now is not just who the characters are and can we identify the protagonist, who's the narrator. That's the sort of simple elementary level. Now we're moving on to thinking more about how characters are portrayed. How are characters presented to us? What kinds of impressions do we have about the characters that we meet? Do we feel positively about them, negatively about them, perhaps a little bit of both? So we can think about our own personal reactions, our own personal opinions about specific characters that we meet. So if you guys think back to the short narratives that we read from Langston Hughes and George Orwell last week, we know that the main characters really were sort of versions of the authors. We had first-person narration in both of those stories. So both Orwell and Hughes were telling stories about things that happened to them, true stories that they were taking from earlier periods in their own lives. So they were the protagonists of their own stories. They were also narrating their own stories. But there were also other characters, particularly in Salvation. We met the young kid Wesley, who was the kid next to Hughes in the church, who sort of has a funny line of dialogue. It's maybe sort of inappropriately funny, but it's kind of important, and Wesley kind of plays an important role in the plot, even though we don't spend much time with him. And we also meet the auntie character. So there are other characters, but you'll notice that some narratives don't have very many characters, and then in other cases, other narratives might have very large casts of characters. It just depends. We know that. You guys have seen enough movies or read enough to already know that. But just keep in mind that people are not the only things that can be characterized or described or presented in certain ways in narratives. Places can also be characterized. Some places are presented in positive ways, and they make the reader feel good, or the reader has positive associations with that place. Other places might be presented or described in a more negative way. We might associate that place with violence or something bad or some kind of tragedy. So places can be characterized. People, obviously, objects, animals, I mean, virtually anything. But any character or key place or object that you find in a narrative, you need to have an opinion about it. That's really all this particular concept is trying to sort of get us to do. You're just trying to form original opinions about all the key players, all the key characters or places or things in the narrative. You need to have opinions, judgments. You need to know how you feel about all of that. So let's move on to vocabulary and word choice. This is another pretty easy one to understand. We know what words are, but when you're reading narratives, you need to be very attentive to word choice. And if there are any particular words or phrases that really jump off the page, that really make a strong impression on you for whatever reason, they might make you think a certain way, feel a certain way. They might just be a fun word, an interesting word, a word that you didn't know that you had to look up and now you like it. It doesn't matter what the reasoning is. If this word is noteworthy to you, if it jumps off the page at you for whatever reason, underline it, write an annotation about it, make some kind of note, and you might want to revisit it later. The key thing to remember, another key thing to remember about word choice, and I included these words, these two terms in the PowerPoint and in the Week 3 overview, the words denotation and connotation. I want to make sure you guys understand what these words mean, because this is part of the fun of doing word analysis. We can think a little bit about the actual definitions of words, and we can sort of think about word association as well, which is usually a little more fun. So the denotation of a word simply means the dictionary definition of that word. So if you type the word into Google, one of the first search results you're probably going to get will be a dictionary, Merriam-Webster, or one of those big ones. And you can just, you're a click away from actually seeing the dictionary definition for that word. Great, that's easy enough, that's easy to find. That's denotation. Connotation is a little more slippery. It's a little harder to get a handle on. Basically, the connotation of a word means the associations that that word brings to mind. So if you guys have ever played a word association game, basically you're just exploring connotations. And what's interesting and kind of fun is that, I mean, you guys know about synonyms, right? A lot of different words have essentially the same meaning. In fact, the English language is kind of unique. We have a lot of words in a lot of cases that mean the same thing, more so than a lot of other languages. This is part of what makes English kind of a difficult language to learn, because we have a lot of options when it comes to expressing certain actions, feelings, or ideas. So oftentimes you'll find that two words that basically have the same denotation, they basically mean the same thing, will have different connotations. They will sort of bring to mind different associations. This often means that they will make people feel positively or negatively. So let me give you a quick example. Three words that basically, more or less, mean the same thing if we're just thinking about denotation. So think about the words group, click, not like clicking the remote, but click as in a group of people. That's C-L-I-Q-U-E. Okay, that's the second word, click. And then the third word, club. Again, not a club that you beat somebody with, but a club, a group of people. So again, we can just tell that these three words essentially mean the same thing, right? They all have the same basic denotation. But you guys can probably tell that each of the words that I just gave you have different connotations. They bring different ideas or different feelings to mind when we hear them. So when we hear group, I mean, I can't speak for all of you, but the word group is pretty neutral. I don't think we typically feel positively or negatively about that word. It's just sort of a basic, easy to understand word. However, the word click might, in some cases, carry negative connotations. Sometimes it's associated with like mean kids in school. Not always, because then connotations depend on the individual reader. These are not things that you can necessarily look up in a dictionary, like the denotation of a word. But a lot of people have negative connotations with the word click. It kind of has an air of exclusivity, like not just anybody can join this group, it's only for the cool kids. It might make us think of like a cafeteria in middle school or high school, where everybody's sitting in their own sort of separate groups. So clique, even though it means really the same thing as group, it's a more loaded word. It brings more emotion to the table. It's not as neutral as the word group. You might feel negatively about the word clique. And then you have the word club. Now, you know, fine, most people might not have really strong emotions about club, but you might go one of two ways with this connotation. You might think that club sort of makes it seem like it's little kids. Like, it makes me think of like a treehouse. Like, you know, the neighborhood kids form a club, you know, and it's all kind of fun, and it's little kid, it's kind of juvenile. But we can also think of a club like a country club, like, again, something kind of exclusive, where maybe you have to have a lot of money or some kind of status to be able to join the club. So, depending on the individual, the words club or clique might carry some negative connotations. They might make us think of like yacht clubs or country clubs, rich people or mean people in school, and we might feel a certain way about those words, and we don't feel that same way about the word group, even though, again, the three terms essentially have the same denotation. They could be used pretty interchangeably. But why this matters, as readers, we need to notice the choices that writers are making. So if the writer chooses to use the word clique instead of the word group, there's probably a meaning behind that. And the writer might want us to feel a certain way about this group or clique of people. So again, you can kind of play this game a lot of ways. Like if we're describing environmental activists, if we call them tree huggers, Right? That's a term that has certain connotations, right? Certain negative connotations that might turn some people off. But if we call them activists, or if we call them, young crusaders or something, again, word choice matters, because word choice usually means that the author is making a deliberate decision to present characters or places or things in a particular way. The words they use will have an impact on how the readers perceive whatever it is that's being described. So we have to pay attention to that, right? We can't always know what the writer thinks or means, but we can pay attention to word choice, and we should pay attention to the connotations that we experience, right? The associations that we have when we hear certain words. And even if your friends or fellow readers don't think the same thing, that doesn't make your reading invalid. Because again, connotations kind of vary from person to person. But another one that I used to use this example: the differences between the words smell, scent, and odor. Right? Three words that have similar denotations, but probably different connotations. You would use them in different settings with sort of different meanings in mind. Odor would perhaps carry more negative connotations. A word like scent, which is often associated with perfume or things that smell good, would carry more positive connotations. So hopefully that makes sense. I probably spent too much time on that one. Let's move to symbolism. And I want to tie symbolism to the larger category of figurative language that we'll be getting into here in a moment. So with symbolism, you're kind of, once again, like I mentioned briefly before, we're sort of leaving the literal level, and we're sort of searching for bigger meanings. So when you're looking for symbolism, you're basically looking for any objects or people or places that might represent larger things, other things. They might represent something else. So they're serving as symbols. And symbols can still have, literal meaning. They might have some literal role to play in the plot of the narrative, but they also have some kind of larger meaning. They represent some larger idea or some other thing that might not be physically present in the narrative, but it's something that the author wants us to consider. It's something that the author wants us to know about. So there's a lot of symbols in our culture that you can think about, just to kind of give you an idea of this. I mean, just think about the American flag, which often functions much like a symbol. It represents a country, a nation. So often the importance of the flag, it goes beyond the physical object of the flag. It's more about what the flag represents. Think about apple pie or roses or the skull and crossbones. Those are all symbols that represent things that most of us know and recognize because they're famous symbols and we've all been exposed to them. But the symbols that you find in narratives work in a similar way. There's a physical existence of those objects or of those people, of those places, but there's also a larger symbolic level that goes beyond the literal or the physical. They represent bigger ideas, bigger things, historical events, whatever, right? It's pretty wide open, but you should look for examples of symbolism as well. And then that takes us to figurative language. So I want to end here. This will be the final concept that I cover today. I want to spend some time on this, and we're going to return to this next week when we talk about descriptive language. So again, figurative language basically just means any figure of speech that takes the reader beyond the literal. The reader is moving beyond the sort of everyday world of literal definitions and literal meaning. And we're trying to express or understand something bigger, something deeper, something potentially more complex. So I think this is part of the fun of being a reader of narrative, because you can still appreciate the literal level. but you should also be aware of the figurative level, which exists sort of on top of, in addition to, the literal level. So when we find figures of speech or different types of examples of figurative language, these are just places in the text, places in the narrative where we're sort of reaching for a larger meaning. The author is trying to express something or illustrate something that goes beyond the literal. So most of us have learned about many of these figures of speech at some previous point in school, and that's fine. This might be review for a lot of us, but I want to go through some definitions. I want you to get these down in your notes, and I'm not going to quiz you on these, but I'm going to expect you to be able to find some of these in the narratives that we read, and I would like to see you guys incorporate some of these figures of speech into your own narrative. So let's start with two terms that I know we've heard before. We've learned about these before. A lot of 101 students can define these terms because you've learned them at some previous point. But sometimes it can be, defining is one thing, but it's more important that we can actually identify them and use them. Sometimes that gets lost. We think we know the definition, and that's good enough. But I want us to be more active when it comes to figures of speech. Let's actually, get comfortable finding these things, using these things. So, starting with metaphors. We probably know what a metaphor is. This is a comparison. A metaphor and a simile. These are both comparisons. But what's interesting is they are comparisons between two unlike things. So a metaphor is comparing two unlike things. Two things that are not similar, two things that are not typically thought of as being in the same category or class. A metaphor is comparing those two things by saying that one is the other. Now that sounds complicated, but it's actually not. We hear metaphors all the time. A lot of them have even sort of entered popular speech as sort of cliches or things that we hear all the time. For example, she is drowning in a sea of grief. That's a metaphor. Now, we've probably heard an expression like that before. We're describing somebody who is very sad, somebody who is mourning, somebody who's obviously going through an extended grieving process. So what we're doing in this sentence is we are comparing the grieving process, feeling sad, mourning a lost loved one, perhaps. We are comparing that experience to drowning in the ocean. All right? So those are the two things that we are comparing. Grieving, mourning a loved one, and drowning in the sea. So those aren't really the same, right? Those are two different things. But in order to express the level of her grief, we want to use a figure of speech because it captures the meaning perhaps better than just saying she's really sad. She's been grieving for a really long time. Because the idea of drowning, the idea of being powerless, the idea of sort of sinking down into the dark depths of the ocean, that really drives home the emotions that she's going through. So this is simply a comparison between two unlike things that really drives home the severity of her grief. By comparing her grief to drowning in the ocean, we're really making a more powerful statement that's going to have a bigger impression on a reader than, again, just a simple statement of, yeah, boy, she's really sad. So you guys kind of see that, I hope. There's the famous line from Shakespeare, the whole world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. Now that's famous because, of course, he's describing life, but he's also sort of describing plays, like in the theater, and of course he wrote plays, so it's fun. But again, it's the same idea, right? He's comparing life, or the world, to a play, all right, a fictional work. Those are not the same. And you might argue that they're not even really fit to be compared to one another. Life is much more important, much more complex, involves a lot more people than any one play. But he's comparing the two things in order to make a point, in order to express an idea. Figurative language allows us to express ideas in more interesting ways, in ways that might be more memorable or more powerful than strictly literal statements. So again, obviously, we don't actually mean that the world's a stage. We don't actually literally mean that the sad person is drowning, right? These are figures of speech. They make a point. So a simile is very close to a metaphor. It's doing the same basic thing. Once again, it's a comparison of two unlike things. But what a simile does that metaphors typically don't do, similes use the words like or as, typically. So a metaphor sort of dispenses with the middlemen, and the metaphor just says thing A is thing B. The world is a stage. She is drowning. So it's a more direct comparison, if that makes sense. A simile makes the same basic move, but it's saying this one thing is like this other thing. This one thing functions kind of in the same way as this other thing. So the key words to kind of look for to tip you off as to whether or not you're dealing with a metaphor or simile, typically the words like or as. So that can help. I move fast like a cheetah. I'm comparing myself to a cheetah. Those are two obviously very unlike things, but I'm not necessarily saying I am a cheetah, as I would if I was sticking to a strict metaphor. I'm saying that I move like a cheetah. I actually wanted to share an example from shooting an elephant, if I can find it. An example of a really good simile that I underlined when I was reading. So I'm in the 5th edition. I know not all of us are using it. It's on page 277 of the 5th edition, but you don't have to follow along, just listen. He's describing what would happen. Well, I'll just read the 2 sentences. If the elephant, no, it's just 1 sentence. If the elephant charged and I missed him, I should have about as much chance as a toad under a steamroller. So at this point, he's sort of debating whether or not to shoot the elephant, and he wants to get a little bit closer to the elephant, but he's afraid that he might slip in the mud, and if that happens, he's afraid the elephant will trample him. But instead of just saying the literal statement, I'm afraid the elephant would trample me, he finds a figure of speech. I should have about as much chance as a toad. So he's comparing himself to a toad under a steamroller. This is quite a visual image that he paints through the simile. So you guys will notice that with these terms, there's overlap. So figures of speech will often create imagery. These are not things that have to be kept separate from one another. There's a lot of sort of bleeding across one thing to the next. So he's describing what he would look like under the elephant to a toad being squashed by a steamroller. So Orwell is not really like a toad, and the elephant is actually not really like a steamroller, but by giving us that simile and by painting a picture, he's far more expressive and interesting than he would have been if he just said, I was afraid the elephant would step on me. Okay? But that's what he's expressing, right? That's the literal meaning. But by comparing himself to a toad, it's just more fun. It's more expressive, and it taps into our imagination. And it makes us more likely to remember and enjoy the passage. So, oh yeah, and I skipped another example that I wanted from Salvation. I know it's too late, but when we were talking about metaphors, this was just a very brief moment, but we were thinking about the woman grieving who was drowning in a sea of grief. Well, at one point, Hughes uses a similar figure of speech in Salvation. He mentions a sea of shouting. So it's not quite as developed as the other metaphor, but this is still kind of the same thing. He's in a church, not at sea. It's loud in the church. But instead of just saying that, he describes a sea of shouting, right? So he's describing the experience of being in the church to something else. in order to express what it felt like, what it sounded like, not just what it looked like, also what it sounded like inside that church. So again, don't get intimidated by metaphors or similes. They are simply comparisons between unlike things. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me cover these other ones quickly. Personification. That simply means an author is attributing human qualities to non-human things. And we see this a lot. Opportunity knocked at my door. That's actually an example of personification, because opportunity is not a tangible thing. Like, opportunity is an idea, it's a concept, it's a word, it's not a physical thing. It doesn't have hands, it cannot knock on a door. The sun greeted me this morning. The sun cannot actually do that. The sun doesn't greet people. That's what a person would do. All right. So we're giving human qualities to the sun, or an abstract concept like opportunity. Sometimes animals might be given human qualities. At one point in Orwell's piece, he mentions that the elephant had a grandmotherly air. That's kind of a slight, brief example of personification, at least comparing the elephant kind of briefly to a grandmother. Just kind of making us think about humans when non-humans are described. And that can have a very particular effect on readers. The next one is hyperbole. That just means intentional exaggeration. So if you can remember growing up at your parents' house, or if you have children of your own, you've probably used hyperbole before, or you've heard it, depending on which side of this you were on. I told you a million times to clean your room. Chances are the speaker has not really told the child a million times to do that. Maybe 5 or 10. But the intentional exaggeration is done in order to emphasize, in order to call attention to whatever it is that's going on. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. I used to always hear adults in my family say that. I thought it was weird because I don't know a lot of people who eat horses. But of course they were exaggerating. They were not actually going to eat a horse. They would not be able to do that physically, I don't think. Not an entire horse. But they were just trying to express that they were very hungry. So in order to add emphasis, you exaggerate. And then finally, allusions. I want you guys to be clear on what allusions are. Allusions with an A. Allusion with an I means some kind of, deceptive thing, some kind of mirage. That's not what I mean. Here, I mean an allusion with an A, which is a reference to something or person or event that exists outside the text. That's what's important. So these will often be like cultural references. Like if an author mentions maybe a TV show or a celebrity or, an actor or something, some famous person that doesn't have a role. It's not a character in the narrative, but it's just something that another character or the narrator just mentions. Maybe as part of a comparison. Maybe to help us better understand the historical setting. There's a lot of reasons for this. In some cases, we make allusions to sort of shared culture, things that most people know, but these are things or events or characters that aren't actually in the story. They're just, again, it's a figure of speech. We're just sort of using them to help us express our meaning. So, for example, if you've ever heard the term, Achilles' heel, that was his Achilles' heel. That's an allusion. Unless Achilles is actually a character in that narrative. I mean, Achilles is a figure from Greek mythology. So when we talk about an Achilles' heel, we're making a reference to a character that's probably not in our text, but most people know what that term means. It means like your weakness, your fatal flaw. The only way you could hurt Achilles was by striking him in the heel. So we know what that means, but that's an allusion, right? Or if we say something like, I'm surprised his nose wasn't growing like Pinocchio, right? Pinocchio doesn't have to be a character in the story in order for us to get that reference. you mean that somebody's lying, right? But instead of just saying the literal, you're using an allusion to express that same idea in a more interesting, fun way. Or if you describe a place in the narrative as the Garden of Eden, right? You're not actually taking us to the Garden of Eden, but you're making a comparison that's based on a reference to something that most of us know, but it's not actually a feature of your narrative or the narrative that you're reading. It's a reference to something outside, but it makes sense. It's connected to what's happening, or it's just shared knowledge that your readers will recognize and understand. So that's all I have for figurative language. I think I also put the word theme in the list. We already talked about theme last week. It's just another word for narrative point, or the overall meaning or message of a text. But just keep that. I just wanted to put the word there just so we don't lose sight of it, because I'm giving you a lot of words that mean the same thing. Narrative point, overall meaning, theme. We can use those terms interchangeably, but just remember, you have to think about the theme of any narrative that you read. What does it all mean? And analyzing these different elements will help you to determine what the overall theme is. There might be multiple themes, but doing this kind of work with characters, setting, imagery, different figures of speech, all of these elements, studying them, looking for them, thinking about them will help us to better understand those overall larger themes at work. So that's it for week 3. Next week we will start on descriptive writing, which is fun. I'll have some videos to show you. Oh, and speaking of videos, I do recommend that you guys check out some of those additional examples of narratives that I posted in the week 3 module. There's some fun videos. If you haven't watched them already, check them out. Make sure to do the reading. I hope we all have books by now. I am not posting PDFs for the entire class anymore. However, on an individual basis, if you've made it to the end of this video and you still don't have a book, if you're having issues getting the book, if you need a PDF version of this week's reading posted, you need to ask me individually through email and we can work something out. Otherwise, I'm just going to trust that we have books. So good luck. Get in touch with me if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.